right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Good evening. I would like to welcome you to the ARCO Forum. My name is Melissa Liazos. I am an undergraduate here at Harvard and a member of the Student Advisory Committee at the Institute of Politics. Actually, before we begin, I have one important correction to make. On the posters for this event, there were several co-sponsoring organizations listed, one which is listed as the Harvard American Israel Political Action Committee, or HIPAC, but that is not actually what HIPAC stands for. What it stands for is the Harvard Israel Public Affairs Committee. So I just wanted to apologize to HIPAC for that and to apologize to the rest of you as well. To return to our discussion, the title of our panel for the evening is Prospects for Peace in the Middle East. And clearly this is an area of great interest and concern to all of us. The upcoming round of peace talks has come out of the efforts of many previous talks, and it seems that this time hopes are pretty high. Each side seems to be willing seems to have a renewed interest in negotiating and compromising. The focus of our talk this evening will be on what is expected to come out of this round of talks, as well as on what the role of each side should be. Our moderator will be Professor Roger Fisher. Roger Fisher is the director of the Harvard Project on Negotiations and the Williston Professor of Law Emeritus at Harvard Law School, where he has taught since 1958. Prior to joining the law school faculty in 1958, he worked for the U.S. government in Paris, practiced law in Washington, D.C., and served as an assistant to the Solicitor General in the Department of Justice. Professor Fisher has taught and written extensively on international law and on international conflict. His books include Getting to Yes, Getting Together, Building Relationships as We Negotiate, and Dear Israelis, Dear Arabs, A Working Approach to Peace. He is chairman of the steering committee of the Program on Negotiation, a consortium of dispute resolution programs among Harvard, MIT, and Tufts. Professor Fisher has 30 years' experience dealing with international conflict as an advisor and as a strategist. He advised both the Iranian and the U.S. governments in negotiations for the release of American hostages in 1981. He helped to design the process for the successful Camp David negotiations between President Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Begin of Israel. It is my pleasure to present to you, Prime Minister, pardon me, our moderator, Roger Fisher.
Thank you very much.
I wonder if he had a word with her.
In order to give time for as many questions as we can, we've asked each of our speakers to open up with about 5 minutes of remarks, and then we'll have a little dialogue among them if they'd like questions or comments about each other's thoughts. And then I've also promised them we will adjourn no later than 7:30. The title of Prospects of Peace in the Middle East, I did not want them all just saying they are so-so or not very good but not very bad or better than they've been. And each one should, in addition to just predicting what they think is going to be, should make some suggestion as to who might do what to improve the prospects, as to what, looking forward, as to what might be done. Our first speaker, a Palestinian, like his father and grandfather, I understand, was born in the old city of Jerusalem. He studied here in the States, graduating with a magna from Brigham Young. He studied at the University of London, George Washington, and here at Harvard he received his PhD about 10 years ago. He is currently an adjunct professor at Brigham Young and a senior fellow here at our Harvard's Institute for Social and Economic Policy in the Middle East. From our point of view tonight, he is most interesting perhaps as currently a member of the Palestinian delegation to the multilateral peace talks, which are tentatively at least scheduled to resume next week in Washington. Bishara Baba, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It gives me great pleasure to be here tonight, particularly with such a distinguished group of panelists. Much to Professor Fisher's chagrin, I'm going to restrict my remarks today to give my interpretation of the apparent current impasse in the peace talks. First of all, I believe that the recent decision by the Arab foreign ministers who met in Damascus and have resumed their talks today again in Damascus to postpone attending the talks which were scheduled for tomorrow, should not be interpreted as a boycott of the peace process by either the Palestinians or the Arabs. The Palestinians know very well the value of the peace process. In fact, one can argue that the Palestinians were the party to the Middle East peace talks that made the most concessions to simply participate. If you recall, Israel insisted on the exclusion of the PLO, refused to deal with a separate Palestinian delegation, refused to allow Palestinians from Jerusalem and the diaspora to be part of the Palestinian bilateral peace delegation, and refused to allow items of utmost importance to be on the agenda, such as the issue of Jerusalem. Therefore, no one can accuse the Palestinians of not making a sincere effort in the making of peace in the Middle East. The second point I would like to make is that the Palestinians have sought the postponement of the peace talks that were scheduled for tomorrow to resolve outstanding issues. This postponement could last a few hours or a few days. It all depends on how and when these outstanding issues are resolved. Thirdly, some of these outstanding issues that the Palestinians are seeking a resolution for include the issue of the deportees, which is obviously the most visible issue. In this case, the Rabin-Christopher Agreement evades rather than implements UN Security Council Resolution 799 that calls for the immediate return of the Palestinian deportees. The Palestinians have gone to the extent of offering numerous suggestions to try and resolve this issue, including a willingness to accept the return of the deportees on a reasonable but firm timetable. Another issue that the Palestinians are seeking clarifications on relates to the terms of references, which means the understandings reached between various parties to the conflict and the hosts of the peace conference regarding the peace talks. The Palestinians are asking that Israel recommits itself to the terms of reference. From a Palestinian perspective, this recommitment is needed, given that Israel has not respected those commitments thus far. For example, the terms of references forbid parties to the conflict from engaging in activities that prejudice the outcome of the peace talks. Israel continues to build settlements, although at a slower rate, that prejudices the outcome of the peace talks, and Palestinians continue to be imprisoned without charges, trial, or due process of the law. A third issue of concern to Palestinians is Israel's refusal thus far to state that United Nations Resolutions 242 and 338 apply not only to the final stage of the negotiations, but also to the current talks that deal with the interim self-government for the Palestinians. The Palestinians cannot negotiate in a vacuum and want its negotiations with Israel to be based on UN Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338. A fourth issue that the Palestinians want to see resolved pertains to the current situation in the occupied territories. The Palestinian leadership cannot accept upon itself to send a peace delegation to Washington, D.C., while the conditions on the ground are deplorable and the political environment is poisoned. The economic embargo imposed on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip over the past few weeks is choking the population, causing tremendous hardships, and could lead, according to the local chambers of commerce, to starvation. These were the four issues that the Palestinians are seeking clarifications on at the present time and have requested the United States government to play a role in that process. One other point I would like to make, and that is there is widespread skepticism among Palestinians everywhere about the utility of the current peace talks under the existing conditions. Palestinian public opinion is skeptical. The thriving of democracy among Palestinians compels the leadership to listen to the wishes and concerns of the population. Therefore, unless the conditions on the ground improve and an acceptable political environment is created, Palestinians have little choice but to seek better conditions for the resumptions of the talks. In the 1.5 years since the Madrid Peace Conference, Palestinians have been offered very little to sink their teeth into. One point I would like to make, and much has been said about, is the issue of Hamas, the Islamic fundamentalist movement in the occupied territories. The point that needs to be made here is that it is the lack of progress in the peace talks and Rabin's decision to expel alleged Hamas supporters that led some Palestinians to support Hamas, which opposes the peace talks. It is in Israel's interest and in the interest of the Palestinians to resume the talks and to achieve recognizable, tangible, and significant progress. The key here is in Israel's hands. Finally, yes, the Palestinians have been told by the United States government that if they agree to the resumption of the talks, then they will find on the table enticing US proposals which had been accepted by Israel, and that some of these proposals meet Palestinian concerns. When pressed by the Palestinians for details, officials at the State Department said that Israel would be willing to issue a statement, for example, relating to the issue of deportation. Such a statement, according to State Department officials, would say that Israel has no intention at the present time to deport any Palestinians. This statement could very well be accurate. However, it is non-committal and subject to change by Israel. What would stop Israel a few days or a few weeks after the resumption of the talks from resorting to deportation once again? To conclude, I would like to say that the Palestinians want to see a resumption of the peace talks. Potentially, they could have the most to gain. However, the Palestinians cannot and will not participate in aimless negotiations with no time limit and no end in sight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baba. Our second speaker was born in England but moved to Israel at a very tender age. How were you, 2 years old, one?
I prefer not to prejudice myself. But it was 3.
3, all right. Upon completing his military service, he studied Hebrew University, where he received his bachelor and master's degree and served as a teaching assistant. Shortly thereafter, he joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he served at the Consulate General in New York as Deputy Director and later as Director of the Information Director of Public Affairs in the ministry in Jerusalem. He's also served as counselor at the embassy in Rome, as the non-resident charge in Malta, and now Consul General in Boston. It's a pleasure to have you here, Yaakov Levy.
Thank you for the introduction. Indeed, it's my pleasure to be on this panel, not only for this presence together with distinguished professors and journalists, but I must say especially on being on a panel with my Palestinian colleague. And I really welcome this ability to engage in dialogue together. And essentially, I could really stop my introduction here, because this is what the peace process is all about. And I would hope, Mr. Bahaba, that we would focus not so much on the impasse, but rather on the prospects. That's what I plan to do, at least in the introduction, but of course would be happy to relate also to the impasse. And just saying in word of introduction that we regret that the Arab delegations, and particularly the Palestinian delegation, has decided not to come tomorrow to the reconvening of the talks. We hope indeed that it will be just a postponement of hours, as you indicated, although the feeling is that it might be a few days, perhaps a week. We in Israel hope that it will indeed not go beyond a few days, and that early next week we can resume the peace talks. I'd like to sketch in my brief introduction just a few points as far as where the process stands today, say a few words about the opportunities, and a word about some risks, and conclude with a word of hope, perhaps. I would say that, I would say with a degree of caution, but I think with a strong belief, that we have embarked upon a process which by now, after a year and a half of negotiations, is irreversible. That is, the situation between Arabs, Israelis, Palestinians now, a year and a half after the Madrid conference began, will probably never revert to the situation which existed in 43 years of conflict. And I think the agreement of all parties that whatever the differences of opinion, and even if we postpone our arrival at one round of the talks or come in a little late, the principle that the conflict has to be settled through negotiations is agreed upon and endorsed by practically everyone, to the exclusion of a few radical groups which are trying to sabotage the process. But my feeling is that neither the Palestinians, nor the Arabs, nor the Israelis will allow it. We have a large number of Arab parties negotiating with us. As you know, 4 delegations negotiating on a bilateral level. But on the multilateral level, in the talks to be resumed next week and perhaps early May in 5 different sites around the world, in these multilateral talks, so far we have 13 Arab delegations sitting with us, as well as 30 other participants, all the nations of the world practically. That shows the degree of commitment and readiness to negotiate and to reconcile the differences in a way which is completely different than the way which characterized Arab-Israeli relations for 4 decades. I think the very fact, and permit me in saying this in your presence, that's my feeling, you might disagree, but I have the feeling that not, but the very fact that for the first time the Palestinians are sitting together with us as an independent delegation at the bilateral talks, even though there is a track which is common to the Jordanians and Palestinians, the fact that neither they nor the Arab world has usurped or delegated that responsibility to speak to them, and the fact that Israel agreed to it as part of the Madrid formula and is continuing this process, I think that is telling and of great importance, even though there's been a decision by the Palestinians and the Arab delegations to postpone their arrival, even though the talks might begin a week or a few days later. That is of critical importance. Another element, which perhaps is not so apparent to the naked eye, but I think is of great importance, is that a psychological process has begun perhaps as early as 1977, when President Sadat came to Israel and began the negotiations which culminated in the treaty with Egypt, which most recently was marked by its 14th anniversary. That psychological process has begun, and I would say is continued in earnest, even at the most difficult bilateral sessions. That process of talking to each other and demonizing, the process of de-demonization of your former enemy, of your adversary, is of critical importance, even though it is an intangible. Of course, another important element is the change in the global environment, and the removal of the Soviet Union from automatic backing of any adventurist in the Arab camp is of importance, because it removes a layer, the global layer of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And finally, I would say we are now in the middle of a process of fruition on the Israeli side, I think on the Syrian side to a degree, and I believe on the Palestinian side, but that's perhaps a query I'd like to relate to my colleague, of a process which will lead the societies and the governments and the leaders to reconciliation and to peace. We are looking for signs in Israel. We're looking for these signs on the Arab side, especially in Syria, perhaps also in Jordan, which will go beyond the official leadership and the guided press. I would hope that we'll see these signs in a marked way in the near future. The prospects, just briefly, we hope in the coming round of negotiations to reach a joint statement of principle with the Syrians, which will be based on the elaboration of the essence of peace to govern relations between us and the Syrians. We hope to discuss with them the issues of security common to both countries, and as a part and parcel of it, the territorial issue on the Golan Heights, where Israel already declared a readiness to withdraw armed forces from parts of the Golan Heights, to be discussed based on the Syrian definition of the essence of peace. We hope to make real progress with the Palestinians, initially for self-rule for an interim period, and then to make progress regarding a definitive solution. And indeed, with the Jordanians, we hope to make progress in fulfilling the agenda already attained in the earlier rounds of talks. I want to underscore Israel's earnest commitment and its desire to attain peace in this and future rounds of talks, based on the concept of compromise. We recognize that compromise has to be reached, but on both sides. I would just very briefly list a few of the risks entailed in the process. Some of them have been alluded to by my colleague. I would just like to point out the other side of these risks, at least the way Israel sees it, the need for security for Israel vis-a-vis some radical elements in the Arab world, the need for security as far as terrorism and the stabbings which caused the expulsion of the Hamas militants. It did not come out of the blue air, neither did the measures taken most recently confining or limiting the ability of Palestinians in the territories from coming to Israel every day to work. There was a reason for it, the stabbings and killings of many Israelis. But finally, I really came here with the intent of underscoring the hope. And I strongly believe, as a young Israeli whose family and as himself has participated in a variety of ways in the facets of the conflict between Arabs and Israelis, I believe that we are finally approaching the possibility to resolve these differences peacefully. Israel is committed to do so in the coming rounds of talks, and even though there is not an impasse, but perhaps a postponement for whatever reasons, we hope once the talks are renewed, we could vigorously commit ourselves to this hope and hopefully attain these agreements between us and our Arab neighbors.
Thank you. The third and final member of our panel, another alumnus of Harvard College. He worked for the Sunday New York Times, the Washington Daily News, was a Nieman Fellow here, during which he spent the entire time at the Harvard Law School, practically. Then covered the Supreme Court for the New York Times, was head of the New York Times London Bureau for several years, and now lives in Cambridge here as a columnist for the New York Times, a twice Pulitzer Prize winner for his writing, Anthony Lewis. Tony?
Thank you, Roger. I think I listened just now to Mr. Levy with hope. I think on the scale of hope and pessimism, I would express what W.S. Gilbert called modified rapture. I think there is what Consul Levy said, something different. It's been there since Madrid. But I think realism requires us to appreciate that the glow of Madrid, that moment when these people sat down together for the first time and when the head of the Palestinian delegation said, we want peace, that moment of great optimism has considerably faded. And I think we ought to consider concretely why that is so and what can be done about it. I think one thing that the last week has shown us is that there cannot be, put it this way, that if Prime Minister Rabin and the Israeli government believed there could be a separate peace with Syria, and one thinks that they might have believed that because there's been so much emphasis, understandably, on the hope of a breakthrough with Syria, that belief has been ruled out, I think, in a practical sense. Because it's clear to me after the postponement that what many experts believed is so, that with all the power Hafiz al-Assad has in his country, Syria, it is not politically possible for him to proceed to a conclusion, that is, the only conclusion there can be to bring peace, a full treaty with Israel, a peace treaty, without the Palestinians, without their process coming along too. Another thing I think has to be realistically understood as a result of developments since Prime Minister Rabin expelled the 400 Palestinians in December as supporters of Hamas, is that mode of dealing with the security crisis, and I agree with Mr. Levy, it was a genuine security crisis. When people are knifed in the streets, knifing is a peculiarly personal form of terror. It's not pushing a button from a distance, it's not dropping a bomb from a plane. You're right next to the person doing it, and it's pretty scary when it happens. So it was a genuine security concern. But I think that what's followed the deportations shows that, namely, more terror until just now the occupied territories were simply shut off, shows that deportation is not an answer to the problem. Nor, I think, can anyone believe anymore that there is a military to the answer to the problem. To me, it is more obvious than it has ever been that the only answer to the Palestinian-Israeli problem is a political answer in which people will live together. Now, what does that take? I think both of the previous speakers have indicated that they fall among the group of people in their two camps who want peace. But there are people in both camps who don't want peace. And what should be the object of the parties who want peace? Now, here I don't claim to be Roger Fisher, and I can't, give his, I'm very serious, I can't speak as he would about theories of negotiation, but one thing is obvious to me. If you want to make peace with another party, you have to accept and build up the legitimacy of the other party. And Israel, as the preponderant of the side of the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, that's just a result of the situation, ladies and gentlemen. They are a state. Israel is a state. It occupies the territory in which the Palestinians who are represented by the negotiators live, out of whom they come, I could perhaps more accurately say. It controls them militarily. It tells them what they can do. It makes laws. They are the dominant party. So I think the burden lies on Israel to foster the legitimacy of a Palestinian negotiating partner. Now, what it did with the deportations was the opposite of fostering legitimacy. It made life difficult, perhaps impossible, for the Palestinian delegation, because Hamas could say, you go back to the negotiations and you're selling out the Palestinians. And that is indeed the pressure that those negotiators feel. Similarly, I would say that something that's most earnestly needed in the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations is a signal from the Israeli side of a weight being given to those talks equal to the weight that is being placed on the hope, striking hope, and I think justified hope, of a treaty with Syria. Now, what kind of signal could that be? One would be, and here I may be becoming too detailed, a change in the principal negotiator. Prime Minister Rabin did change the negotiating team with Syria. He has not done so with the Palestinians, and the principal negotiator for Israel, Mr. Rubinstein, is, as a holdover from the previous government, is regarded as a symbol of intransigence, of unwillingness to compromise. I don't know whether that's fair, but the symbol is undoubtedly there, and I think a change in that position would be very important. But more than the symbol is the substance. I think we can all see that if there is to be peace and there is to be legitimacy for a Palestinian delegation, that delegation has to be able to show something of substance coming out of the negotiation. Now, what can it be? We can sit here. One possibility is an election, which Israel at times has been reluctant about and at times has said yes. I think an election in the occupied territories, a genuine free election, would provide a kind of legitimacy, undoubtedly, for those in the Palestinian camp who want peace. Another very important, and here I ought to stop because I really did want to limit myself to 5 minutes.
We all failed.
Well, I'm going to be close. I think more important is the substance. And what's the substance? They are talking in the Palestinian-Israeli negotiation about only an interim agreement, not a final agreement, for a period of years. But there is going to be created some kind of Palestinian authority. And that authority, whatever it's called, has to have some power. So far, Israel has not been forthcoming about what kind of powers. That has to be for the negotiation. I understand that. But to be forthcoming on that subject, yes, you can do something aside from pick up the garbage. Yes, you may have a police force. You must have a police force. We're going to rely on you not for external security, that's our business, but for the ordinary policing. To indicate that that authority will have some legitimate power, that would, I think, create the support for negotiation in the occupied territories that I agree with Mr. Bakwa is skeptical now because people don't see what good they're going to get out of the negotiation. Unless they can see a result, there's going to be skepticism. No one wants more than I do a result from these talks. I think peace between those parties is vastly overdue, greatly overdue, and I think it would be of the greatest benefit, as both of the previous speakers have said, to all concerned. So let's get on with it.
Perhaps since many of his comments are directed to you, unless you want to go first, Mr. Baba. Go ahead. Let Ms. Levy respond a little bit to Tony's comments, but not at great length, please, Yakov.
Sure. Just a few comments relating to both speakers, if possible. I might agree with many of the things Mr. Lewis illustrated here, but I would take issue with a couple of them. What I'd agree with is that we did not expect realistically that there would be prospects for separate peace with Syria. And I don't think you would find it even in the Israeli vocabulary, because we are mindful of that aspect. What we were looking for is a realistic assessment of where we could make some progress and where the impasse would be of larger magnitude. First, indeed, we thought it was with Syria. Later on with the Palestinians. To our pleasant surprise, it became with the Jordanians. With the Jordanians, we have an agreed upon agenda. And we will, hopefully, when the talks renew, we will begin to tackle it item by item, as we already begun in December. We're not looking for a separate peace with Jordan along these lines of prospects, because we realize that there's a degree of coordination amongst the Arab delegations. We cannot influence that degree, we can just observe it. This time we observed it with regret, because that coordination brought about the postponement, or as you said, the impasse. My comment about the impasse, Mr. Vahaba, would be that if you have these differences of opinion, if you need these clarifications, what best place to seek them would be but the negotiating table, rather than placing conditions or postponing the talks indefinitely. We agree, Tony, that there's no military solution to the conflict, and I think you can find it in the statements of every responsible Israeli, not only the current government, but I'd say even the Likud government, which, after all, packaged the formula of Madrid. What bothers me to a degree is that you're placing all the onus on Israel. I really didn't hear, and I listened carefully and took notes, in Hebrew, albeit, of the onus you're placing on any Arab party. It's all on Israel. We cannot really lend legitimacy to a Palestinian delegation. I think if we do it, we'd err, because it could be counterproductive. Any leader, any group would be viewed as dependent or even worse on the Israelis. But we do fully endorse elections. In fact, it was Israel that proposed, if you recall, that elections should have taken place as early as April 1st, 1993. It is not because of a reluctance on behalf of Israel that elections have not taken place. We respect the reluctance on some other sides, but we are fully for these elections because indeed they would create a legitimate Palestinian delegation which would have, we hope, the backing of all walks, of most walks of life. I wouldn't comment on replacing one Israeli negotiator or another, even though I'd be tempted to do so, but I would just give one signal. We are talking now not so much about replacing an Israeli negotiator, but about accepting perhaps a prominent Palestinian who would join the Palestinian team once negotiations are resumed, even though that would be a change in the Madrid formula which we agreed upon. To Mr. Bahaba, I just say 2 or 3 brief points, beyond saying that everything you raised here is to be addressed at the negotiating table. That's the best place to do it. I would say that we should not waste our time on changing the Madrid package. I believe it's the best we could reach under the circumstances at the time. Don't forget the circumstances after the war in the Gulf, with the way the feelings ran in the Middle East, even though they are not ideal, and many Israelis would like to change some of the terms of reference. If we reopen it now, we're going to waste months and perhaps years in fruitless negotiations over procedures. Let's go ahead with the business of negotiating. And I just conclude my comments with 2 quick pointers. It is, I think, if I may say so, equally the interest of the Palestinians that the talks be renewed, not just of the Israelis. I hope you'd see it in the same light. I, as an Israeli, definitely see that the interest of both of our people should be parallel along these lines and should converge at the negotiating table in Washington. And I must tell you that, and the audience, that for the Israeli public to continue to demonstrate these feelings that Mr. Lewis indicated in his first comment, it also has to have a degree of reassurance that there is some degree of forthcoming from the other side. And when that degree of forthcomingness is kind of tempered by, and I'm putting it mildly, by these stabbings or by acts of terrorism or car bombs, that to many Israelis reduces the sense of the full commitment towards the peace process. So I would look for these kind of signals from the other side, either verbal or in kind.
Thank you. Mr. Baba, do you want to comment on some other
Yes.
points you'd like to make before we go to the audience?
The point that you make, that whatever points Palestinians or concerns Palestinians have should be brought to the negotiating table, obviously is a point that has been argued to the Palestinians over the past several weeks and months. What I'm trying to do here is to explain the sensitivity from a Palestinian perspective of packing your luggage and going to Washington, D.C. one more time and going back empty-handed. Now, the Palestinians, given the previous sessions, literally have little hope that going back to Washington is going to lead to anything at this point in time. Now, if the Israelis are so concerned about the Palestinians going back to the negotiating table, the issues that the Palestinians have raised in terms of assurances, these issues can be made not necessarily on a podium, behind the scenes, with the U.S. State Department's involvement, and they would reassure the Palestinians relating to the issue of terms of references. And here, the Palestinians do not want to reopen the Madrid package at this point in time. They want reaffirmations pertaining to that, to the terms of references, and pertaining to resolutions 242. And of course, on the issue of the deportees, I mean, I live in Washington, D.C. As a Palestinian delegate, I'm safe and sound in one of the suburbs of Virginia. There are others who live in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. Imagine someone, their neighbor, who happens to resent the fact, as all Palestinians do, that Palestinians were deported forcibly while the peace negotiations were going on. Imagine that delegate being accused of being a traitor. I mean, and there are radicals among Palestinians that can go to other extents. And therefore, you are the one who is putting in danger the entire peace process through that issue of, obviously, if you are saying that most of the deportees are Hamas supporters, then what Rabin has done is essentially made a hero out of Hamas in the occupied territories. So he has not helped the peace process. One final point. There was a discussion here about providing legitimacy to the Palestinian delegation and so on and so forth. I really don't think it is in Israel's business to be involved in legitimizing the Palestinians, whether they participate in the peace talks or not. I think it is up to the Palestinians to select their own delegates, to provide them with the legitimacy, or to take away from them the authority to speak on their behalf. I think that is an issue that is best left to the Palestinians.
Thank you. Let's open up. Tony, please.
I've got to have a turn.
Quick.
Well, I seem to have offended both parties with my word legitimacy, and I perhaps should make clear what I mean. Of course, Israel cannot supply legitimacy in the sense that the two other speakers have meant. What I meant was what I think Mr. Bachler just indicated. By legitimacy, I mean the hope, a reasoned hope, that you will get something in the process of negotiation. Otherwise, it is indeed Hamas that will be the hero. If in fact all that happens is people go to meetings and nothing ever transpires there, and meanwhile others are deported, that will not serve the purpose of peace. That's all I meant. I didn't mean in the sense of choosing the delegates or anything like that. But I want to say to Mr. Levy that I'm very glad to have that full endorsement of the elections. The history isn't quite as clear as he said, because there's been backing and filling on Israel's part, especially on the part of Prime Minister Shamir, former Prime Minister, on whether there could be elections. But it's good that that is settled. I agree with him that the signal of accepting Faisal Husseini as a delegate is a very important one. I agree with him that the Israeli public needs reassurance. That reassurance, I think, can come only from political progress. If I were to take a hopeful view of the current very harsh closing of the occupied territories. Just think about it, ladies and gentlemen. One day, you are a citizen. You're not a citizen. You're just a resident, because you're not a citizen of anything. It's a rather tough existence. You're a resident of these territories. You live in Ramallah or in Gaza. And one day, you discover that you are not able to go to work at your job, the job you've had for years in Israel proper, that there's no money for your family, et cetera, et cetera. It's very harsh. If I were to take an optimistic view of that, I would say that it may, in a sense, a harsh sense, but nevertheless a sense, signal a movement in Israel toward the view that only by separation, by the acceptance of a Palestinian entity separate from Israel, can there be the kind of security that Mr. Levy so rightly wants, that any of us would want. That Palestinians have to be given some control of their own destiny and some political power, including the power to prevent security violations and terrorism if people are to live together.
All right, let's open it up to questions from the audience. If you'd go to one of the microphones or the other. First question right here, please, sir.
This is
Address
sort
your,
of, excuse me?
address your question to one of the speakers or make it clear to whom you're speaking.
Yes, well, this is very closely related to what Mr. Lewis just said. He almost took the words out of my mouth, but I'll elaborate a little bit. This is sort of thinking about the unthinkable. And I was reflecting yesterday on this closure of the occupied territories. This question is particularly directed at Professor Fisher, and it may reflect a certain amount of lack of current knowledge of the situation on the ground. What I'd like to ask is this freeze all that bad? Is it possibly the symbol of a salutary separation of the two communities? On the one hand, the Israeli government, by this action, demonstrates that there is a distinction between Israel proper and the occupied territories. On the other hand, the Arab community has to have a heightened consciousness that it is terrorists within its midst that was the precipitate cause of this freeze and the resulting suffering that has been done to them by members of their own community. I'd like to have reactions, particularly from Professor Fisher as a negotiator on this modest proposal to take a word from the past.
I thought I was an impartial chairman here. Let me just come a quick reaction to it. I do think that it says two things. It says the occupied territories are different from Israel, and it says we are in charge and we're going to be rough, and it has cuts both ways. And so I think that the political connotation of separateness is somewhat offset by the anger it's generating, but that's just my...
But we still expect you to remain impartial.
That was pretty impressive.
I am impartial.
May I make just a small comment? I find it very hard to, wherever you are right now,
It's right back.
to comprehend your statement, almost justifying or asking the Palestinians as a whole to restrain those amongst them that commit acts of violence. You're asking the impossible. How would the population, or how would most people in the occupied territories know who amongst them is going to pick up a knife and go attack an Israeli? It's an impossibility. That is one thing. Two is that you have to keep in mind that a lot of Palestinians are saying to the Israelis, if you don't like it in the West Bank and Gaza, just simply leave. And if you leave, that solves the problem for the Palestinians by creating their own state. And if you leave, then you're not amongst us in large numbers in terms of soldiers and settlers. So it is saddening to see blood being shed, whether Israeli or Palestinians. However, I think that adds to the urgency of the need to sit down at the negotiating table. And from my perspective, it adds to the urgency for the Israelis to present reasonable proposals to the Palestinians, unlike what has been presented previously by Rabin and Shamir.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a related...
A lot of questioners.
Yeah, very briefly, because it's important. I'd like to relate to Mr. Bahaba's response, really, because I agree with the tone of the question. I think it signals both elements, and I even related to it in a word of my introduction about the processes taking place now, evolving amongst Israelis and in the Arab side. What I'd expect, Mr. Bahaba, is that the leadership in the Palestinian camp would take that position. Sure, I don't expect that every Palestinian who would know who plans to commit such an act, but I would expect the leadership to take such an unequivocal position so as to discourage it. But I must also correct a factual observation you made, because I think it's unfair to those Israelis who fell victim to these stabbings. Most of them were within Israel, within the Green Line. It was not directed primarily or solely against Israelis who are living, or against soldiers in the territories. But what riled most Israelis, as Mr. Lewis correctly pointed, in getting the sense and the sentiment of Israelis, that within Tel Aviv, that in my neighborhood in Jerusalem, you're not safe because someone could stab you. That was the point which went to the heart of the matter of many Israelis.
Let's go to some other questions over here, please, first.
Consul General Levy, following the recent deportations, the West sent out a clear message to Israel. It involved both unequivocal statements about political pressure, and it indicated that it considered these actions unacceptable, in part because they're viewed as endangering the peace process, but also in part because they're viewed as violations of international human rights conventions. Now, as an Israeli who's aware of the security needs of Israel, how do you believe that the West can send similar messages via the Palestinian leadership to the Palestinian people, effectively indicating that it considers attack by Palestinians, such stabbings, both within the Green Line and on the other side, to be similarly unacceptable modes of behavior, and how can it ensure that such messages carry the same effective power?
Well, indeed, it is a problem for Israel to reconcile the need to defend itself, but at the same time to live up to those standards of human rights and democracy which we uphold and we would like to maintain even at the time of conflict. The way of sending the signal to the other side, I think, is very simple. Speaking out loudly, editorializing, writing columns, hint, hint. There's a simple way, and of course political statements by the leadership. But I reiterate, the best way to ensure the lack of continuation of these incidents is to return to the negotiating table. The earlier the better, because that will send a signal to everyone, and it will send a signal to the entire population, I think, that we are committed to the talks and we will work without interruption, perhaps, until they succeed.
Question here.
Yes, my question relates to the relationship between the substance of the negotiations and the atmosphere that surrounds the negotiations that all the panelists alluded to, and the question is directed at Consul Levy. Consul Levy and Mr. Lewis both spoke about the atmosphere of optimism surrounding Madrid, and yet there is also a sense at the same time that the Palestinian delegation is coming home empty-handed, and that is in some way eating away and corroding that atmosphere of hope. Mr. Lewis asserted that was Israel's responsibility to rebuild that atmosphere without questioning the advisability or the inadvisability of that. How can and how has Israel conducted confidence-building measures? What type of measures can be taken to either support or to rebuild that atmosphere of optimism?
Yeah, it's a good question because it really goes to the heart of what we're discussing now. But just first, a brief introduction. What is really lacking in what you captured in your question is what happened when Sadat came to Israel. The visit, the direct contact with the Israeli people, which regenerated the belief and the hope that the conflict could be resolved. We haven't had something like that since Madrid, and even Madrid, beyond the opening ceremony, didn't provide that impetus. What we need, for example, is an Assad coming to Jerusalem, is an invitation to Rabin to come to Jordan, to Amman, to Damascus, some kind of gesture which would capture the imagination, first of Israelis, and build that confidence, which I hope my co-panelists agree is necessary, but I would hope would also capture the imagination of the Arab parties and of the Palestinians. Now, as far as confidence-building measures, yes, I agree that they're necessary, and I must say that I am sure that my colleague here, sitting on the Palestinian delegation, is fully cognizant of a package of confidence-building measures which is either being enacted or is expected to be enacted once the talks resume. I have here with me some of the highlights of it. It contains scores of points. I won't belabor the audience by reading them, but it does have a good number of confidence-building measures which I hope will provide that baggage to take back after the talks and to ensure a sense of satisfaction amongst the Palestinians.
Just may I say
sure.
something? I think that the best confidence-building measure that the Israelis can take is declare that they're willing to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza, let go of Arab lands, and I can guarantee you that within a year, Assad will be visiting Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. Your choice.
Well, Mr. Wahba, you know, if we do that, we'd also be so popular, I can assure you of that. But really, you know that the Madrid formula doesn't really entail these elements, and I'm rather surprised, I mean, I'm amused, but I don't think that's in the cards. We are willing to make declarations and issue confidence-building measures, but I must ask in all seriousness, what kind of confidence-building measures are the other parties ready to enact? I could just give you two examples here. One is to end the riots, the intifada. That will eliminate the necessity for expulsions, for closure, and for all the other reactions which we have to take and don't feel too good about it, believe me. The second confidence-building measure, which is rather obvious, is, if you recall, a year and a half ago, we were talking about a package which would be the freeze of Israeli settlements on one side and the elimination of the illegal Arab boycott of Israel on the other side. Israeli settlements have largely been frozen. We are still waiting for a confidence-building measure in the form of ending the economic boycott of Israel. And this is, for example, one of the elements of an onus which I'd like someone like Mr. Lewis perhaps to consider placing on the other side, if he agrees with me.
I do agree with you, and I have written so. I think the Arab boycott, I think it's long since overdue to be canceled, and I think it would have been an extremely sound confidence-building measure at any time in the last few years to end it. So, yes. The other point that Mr. Levy made, though, I think is a more complicated one, and we have to understand it. He says, stop the terror, or stop the riots, or whatever your word was.
Right.
It's very hard to say to a people who are denied any form of political representation or control, stop the riots. That's the problem. You have a situation in which those who are the terrorists are not subject to any political control among their own people, and indeed measures like the deportations tend to glorify them. That's why I'm so eager to get some kind of political situation which will put some responsibility on a Palestinian authority to do exactly that. You can't tell a disorganized people, stop doing this or that. They have no power to stop it.
No, we are cognizant of it, and that's why it's not an Israeli demand. It is more a formulation of expectation.
Okay. Question here, please.
A question to Mr. Baba, in a way following the end of your last comments. About 40 years ago, Mendes France got quick peace in Indochina by giving himself time limit and say, I'll get you peace or I resign. Suppose this kind of scenario happens, the new election is unrealistic as it may be, Meretz and Peace Now people came to power, and that by running on the agenda that within 1 or 3 months there will be peace. And the representative asks you, tell us clearly with what kind of territories you want us to withdraw, specifically, what kind of government you want to establish there, and what is the quid pro quo in terms of 242. The peace and security, what are you offering us, including what protection are you giving us against attack, for example, by Iraq under the nuclear umbrella of Iran. Let's say it's 10 years from now. And moreover, as a representative of that Shalom Meretz, let's say, says to you, I'll bring it to a plebiscite before Israeli population, either they'll accept it or I resign. So give us your realistic demands and the quid pro quo.
I think that's an excellent question. In terms of territorial demands, the Palestinians and other Arabs want to see Israel withdraw from all the territories occupied in 1967, including East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, West Bank, and Gaza, period. In terms of the time limit for doing that, if there is an Israeli government willing to negotiate with the Arabs on those terms, I believe it would only be a matter of working out the details, and that could very well be a 3 to 12-month period. In terms of what the Arabs will be willing to offer in terms of security and peace, I think that you will find all Arabs, at least the Arabs that you are negotiating with right now, willing to establish normal diplomatic and economic relations with the State of Israel, willing to accept Israel as a neighbor and in their midst, and willing to work out arrangements, security and otherwise, that includes the assistance of the United States through the satellite monitoring and so on, to assure Israel that its territorial integrity will not be a target by the Arab parties. I know that the Palestinians are tired of living in a state of war. The 2 million or so registered Palestinian refugees want to live in peace. They want to go home. And whether the West Bank and Gaza is economically viable or not, that is the Palestinians' problem, but they want to go home. I can assure you that the Palestinians want nothing but a state of their own, a flag of their own, the right to conduct their own affairs in peace with Israel as its neighbor.
You didn't mention Iran and Iraq.
Listen, we are realistic people. I mean, do you expect a minute Palestinian state to be able to control Iran and Iraq? Realistically, I don't think that the Palestinians can offer such a guarantee to the Israelis. However, the Arabs are at war with Israel because of Palestine. Once the Palestinians are satisfied, the Arabs have consistently said that they have no problems with Israel once the issue of Palestine is resolved.
Thank you. Here. Yes, please.
Well, first of all, I would like to answer Mr. Lewis on the point that you just made, that you cannot tell people not to be terrorists. Historically, if you look back to when Israel was created, the extremists were taken screaming and kicking. The moderates have always controlled the extremists in the Israeli society, so it can be done to some degree. But my question is to Mr. Baba, Professor Baba, supposing we go beyond this period and Israel goes out of the West Bank and Gaza, considering that Palestinians kill Palestinians and that there is an extremist element there, do you foresee a cohesive group that will be controlled so that Israel has some sense of security there? Number one. And number two, I wonder if you would comment on the latest book that came out by the Iraqi professor who teaches here. I think his pseudonym is Khalil, I don't know his regular name, where he attacks the Arab intellectual. Thank you.
Roger, could I say a word about the first point?
Sure.
I'd like to just make a comment on your first point, because I think there's a historical misunderstanding here. My point is that people who are struggling for self-determination or statehood but haven't achieved it can't exercise the kind of control you're talking about. And the very historical example of the Jewish pre-state period shows that to be true, because then, at that time, there were extremist terrorist groups that could not be controlled, that murdered the UN Secretary General. Indeed, pretty serious. And it was only after statehood, and indeed only through the courage of David Ben-Gurion in turning back, in stopping the import of weapons for terrorist groups on the ship the Altalena. That was the determining moment that provided for a secure and peaceful state in Israel, when the new state and its government said, no, we have a state now, we're not having any more of this individual armies. That's when you can do it.
Mr. Baba, on the second point.
Well, I'd like to address the first point simply because I have not read that book, so I'm sorry. But Thank you. On your first point, he was the mediator.
Sorry, the
UN
mediator, not the Secretary General. Secretary, that's another place.
Count
You're right,
Bernadotte.
I made a mistake. Count Bernadotte, it was pretty bad.
On your first point, you referred to Palestinians killing Palestinians. Obviously, bloodshed is regrettable no matter who commits the act of violence, one against the other, be that within one's own community or one country, one national against another national. However, why is it that whenever Palestinians do something, they're put on a certain pedestal or judged by a certain rule when all others are judged by a different rule? For example, did or did not this country have a revolutionary war where Americans killed each other? That is not a justification of one killing one another, but it happens among nations. Now, the more important aspect to your question is that, following up on Anthony's point, is that once you have a Palestinian authority, national authority, once you have a government, that government will be able to exercise control over its population much better than the situation right now in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, where literally it is the wild, wild West. I mean, there are certain areas in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip where Israeli soldiers have not set foot in some time. So the killing is regrettable. However, once a government is established, yes, I believe that Israel's security can be guaranteed, particularly from the Palestinian side.
Let's hear it, please.
I'd like to address my question to Consul Levy. Earlier, Mr. Bahaba characterized the support of Hamas under in the general Palestinian population as so strong that should the Palestinian negotiating team return to the table, they would immediately be characterized as traitors throughout the West Bank and Gaza Strip. First, I'd like to ask if you agree with that characterization of Islamic radical power among the general Palestinian population. And if you do, I'd like to ask, how do you think that population could possibly be ready to truly pursue a lasting peace?
May I make a factual correction? There's a tape recorder over there. I have never used the word so strong. Their support in, I did not say that the support of Hamas among Palestinians is so strong. I said that there has been much talk about the increasing support. And there's a significant difference. I cannot, and I will not say that Hamas has the support of the majority of the Palestinians. That is not true.
But you did say that...
I said that it has had increasing support. And what increased that support and sympathy was the issue of deportation. Once the 400 Palestinians were deported, there were a lot of people that were very sympathetic to them.
I understand, but what you did assert, I just want to make the question clear, is that members of the Palestinian negotiation team would not be able to return to the negotiation table because their neighbors would brand them as traitors because they had failed to resolve the deportation issue before returning to the table.
They could brand them. I didn't say would brand them.
But you're not returning to the table because of that assumption.
It's a very important issue because whether they were Hamas supporters or not, they are Palestinians. They have an inherent right to be on their own land. It is against international law, against decency and humanity to expel people from their land. If you don't like what they did, put them in jail, put them on trial.
Well, so is it to stab Israelis in the street of Tel Aviv. But the question is a good question, and I think it was directed to me. I'd like really to relate to it in tying in, originally at least, in tying in a few of the comments made earlier, because I think it all leads to the same issue. A hypothetical question asked about a hypothetical Israeli government, which would be presumably more liberal than the current one, under which Mr. Bahaba unfolded or unveiled a scenario of complete Israeli withdrawal, etc. What I found lacking from this scenario is the element of compromise. And I would really like us, and hopefully have Mr. Bahaba reaffirm the principles of Madrid, which are negotiations, compromise, and within the Madrid formula, you don't have in the cards an independent Palestinian state with a government. We're talking about an interim solution. That's on the agenda at this time. My feeling is that if on one hand we don't come to the talks, and if on the other hand we raise the expectations so high as to emerge from the talks with an independent government, with a full Israeli withdrawal, etc., with no compromise on the other side, then indeed, when a delegation would come back under these assumptions back home, indeed there would be a crash of expectations or failure of expectations. What I think, and I'd hope you can reaffirm it here just to clarify it to the audience, that we are still talking based upon the principles of Madrid, that we are talking about a compromise, and at this stage, not beyond it. Now, as far as the question of Hamas and its influence, indeed, it is a cause of concern for Israelis. Many Israelis who support the current government, and after all, they voted for it, and there was a change 9 months ago, as you know, and I would say, perhaps without sounding too political, that under the circumstances, it's probably the best negotiating stance which the Arabs and the Palestinians can attain, realistically speaking, from Israel. One can dream about full withdrawal and meeting all the Arab conditions. I don't think, realistically speaking, it's going to happen. So what's in the cards is the current formula, and within that formula, it is of concern for Israelis that radical groups like the Hamas indeed exert their influence politically and through stabbings, and even of greater concern that that would lead to making a round of talks, in effect hostage or potentially hostage to the radicals. I say potentially because I hope that our counterparts will come to the talks in the coming days and this episode will be behind us. So that's how I'd like to address the question and really reaffirm those principles of compromise, of negotiations, and of sticking to the Madrid parameters, as imperfect as they might be.
Let me just, Yaakov, let me just say that the question was, if a new government were to ask for peace now and do it, what would be the Arab terms? This was not, we cannot limit the questioners to the Madrid process.
I understand it, Roger, but I still think that an element of compromise in the answer would have been called for.
Let me tell you what the compromise would be in my answer, okay? The West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem comprise about 22% of historical Palestine. From a Palestinian perspective, that's a tremendous sacrifice and compromise, okay? The return, they're not only compromising in a sense, but also you have been all along saying that you want peace and security. You will get peace and security. You will not find rioters, against Israelis once that situation is fulfilled. From the Golan Heights, in terms of the Syrian territories and Jordan, of course, you return those territories in exchange for security, a state of no war, peace, nice resorts in the Golan Heights, expanded trade, and so on and so forth. So I feel that if you want peace and security, the compromise on your part would be to relinquish those territories, and the quid pro quo for the Arabs would be to have their territories back. That's the compromise.
Okay, let's get to more questions. We have about 15 minutes left. I want to get around. Yes, please. You're the blue shirt.
Okay, thank you. This question, I guess, would be directed at Mr. Levy. Whether one thinks that prospects for peace are bright or bleak or good or bad or whatever world one chooses to live in, at least there is sort of one model, and that's the model between Israel and Egypt. And you alluded to that earlier. And I was wondering if you could talk to us about what you think can be learned from the Camp David process and the relationship between Israel and an Arab nation since.
Indeed, I think a lot can be learned from the process of negotiations with Egypt. One is that it's a long process. It didn't happen overnight. We effectively began the talks with the Egyptians after the Yom Kippur War through a separation of forces, an interim agreement in 1975, which was supposed to last for 3 years, the Sadat visit in 77, the Camp David summit in 78, the peace treaty in 79, and implementation in 1982. It's a long-term process. And when we talk about negotiations with the Palestinians, we're talking about a 5-year interim arrangement, which is shorter than the period we had with the Egyptians, but still we're talking about a time which I think both sides will need to build confidence in each other. Secondly, what is necessary will be not only to eliminate the barriers of hostility as we did with Egypt, but also to build a foundation of peace. And that we would like to see in the talks with the Syrians. And I realize we focused mainly today on the Palestinian issue because of the presence of a Palestinian counterpart, but of no less importance is the removal of Syria as an enemy, a former enemy of Israel. And in that sense, I feel that the issue with the Syrians is talking and clarifying the essence of peace. Are they willing really to build a foundation of peace with all the elements entailed in it, diplomatic ties, trade, tourism, etc., or is it just the end of the state of war? So these would be the lessons basically learned, together with one more important psychological one, which was brought about by an earlier question: the need for a bold gesture to build confidence amongst the people. I would stress, of course, the need to build it amongst the people of Israel, but I am at the same time fully cognizant of the Palestinian concerns, as mentioned over here during the debate by my colleague. I would just like to point out that it has to be based on a compromise and not based on one party realizing the maximal position. So if we will see in the cards a kind of bold gesture of the like I mentioned earlier, a visit to Israel of one of the Arab leaders, an invitation to an Israeli to address an Arab parliament, or even it could be something more moderate, the ending of the economic boycott, or the invitation of a group of Israeli journalists to Damascus, let's say, as an example, to interview Syrian leaders, to roam around and get the sense of the people. There are a variety of such confidence-building measures which could be built into the process, and that is the lesson we learned from the negotiations with Egypt. That's what happened during that process.
Thank you. Question here.
Yes, in talking about the resolution to this conflict, I think that most parties agree that we have to speak about resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict on the one hand and the Palestinian conflict on the other, or at least that's how I see it. But I also discern a disturbing trend in Mr. Bakba's remarks, and also what Mr. Lewis said, that almost equates a resolution of the conflict simply to the Palestinian conflict. Mr. Bakba said that if Palestine, I think he termed it in terms of Palestine, if that question is resolved, then the Arab parties have no problem with Israel, which I think is simply historically inaccurate, because in 1948, Israel did not control the territories you're talking about, yet all the Arab countries invaded. And this is similarly true in 1967. They were planning a war, and Israel did not hold these territories. So for an Israeli or for the Israeli government, I think it's important to note that there are two separate issues, here. And in what Mr. Lewis said also, he spoke of in the conflict of granting legitimacy to the other side, and he spoke of the importance of the Israelis to grant legitimacy to the Palestinian delegation, as if Israel existed in a vacuum almost. Not mentioning that the Arab states have the same power to move the negotiations forward by granting legitimacy to Israel, which they still do not recognize as a state. And I wanted to know if either Mr. Lewis or Mr. Bakba would like to comment on these thoughts.
Tony? Of course, I agree with you that for very many years, the implication of your question, the Arab parties, both the states and the Palestinians, declined to talk with Israel, and for some time declined to mention the word Israel. I think that was a tragic mistake, but Madrid was the beginning of what you want. Sitting down, no fencing around about the existence of Israel, its name, its government, all of that is accepted. And the reason that I focused on the Palestinian question is because it's so hard. Of course I agree with you that Israel has to be concerned about reaching an understanding with Syria. Absolutely vital, and nothing could be more important for the security of Israel. After the very important step of demilitarization of the border with Egypt, which was vital. But in both those cases, Israel is dealing with a state, an existing state with a government. The reason I mentioned the word legitimacy, and maybe it was a mistake since nobody seems to like it, is that in dealing with a people who don't have a state and who don't have any structure, you have to give them some hope that the process of negotiation in which they have embarked will produce some concrete result for them, some concrete benefit. Of course, Mr. Levy is right that it can't be a state. This is an interim negotiation. Indeed, Chairman Arafat, in an interview just the other day, affirmed it's only an interim negotiation. We accept the Madrid formula. We're not talking about the ultimate. But even the interim authority that is to be set up must have some meaning to the Palestinians in the territories for their daily life. Otherwise, it will be a waste of time. That's all that I meant. But the process of doing what you want, of accepting Israel, has very dramatically taken place, beginning with Madrid.
You want to comment?
Just very briefly, I think maybe there is a misunderstanding here. When the Arabs in 1948 engaged the Zionist troops in fights and invaded part of Palestine at the time, it was because of the Palestinians. My point here is that the Arabs went to war against Israel because of Palestine, and that gives Palestine, the issue of Palestine, the centrality in the Arab-Israeli talks. Now, at a later point in 1967, Israel invaded Arab territories, Syria and Egypt, and in that regard, that involved other Arab territories. But the bottom line is quite simple. Had it not been for the Palestine question, there would not be an Arab-Israeli conflict. That's what I'm saying.
I'm just trying to understand your point. So then are you saying that are you talking about the territories, if they are turned into a Palestinian state, this resolves the entire conflict?
What I'm saying is that, take for example, countries such as Algeria, Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, just to name a few. If a resolution does take place between the Israelis and the Palestinians, I do suspect that within a fairly short period of time they will have diplomatic relations with Israel. Yes.
Question here.
My questions are addressed to Mr. Levy, who's the only person here I hadn't heard before, and I find your arguments absolutely compelling. And if I didn't know what I know, and if I didn't start some of my thinking at other places, I would walk out totally convinced by everything you've said. But in a number of the instances that you raised, there's other information, there are other starting points, and I'd like to raise 3 examples. One is about the expulsions. I call them expulsions because my understanding is people are deported to their homeland, not from their homeland. With the expulsions in December, I would say that as the situation that preceded the expulsions, the killing of Jews, soldiers, police, and others, was terrifying to people in Israel and to Jews around the world. And as there was a desperate need to respond, and as not responding to that kind of an attack feels horrible to Jews, I would say that there was a profound implication for Jews and Israelis about that the expulsions had profound, deep implications for Palestinians also, and it seems to me that you're not addressing that when you say they should just come back to the table without having that issue resolved. In 48, Palestinians fled or were driven out and were not allowed to come back. In 67, Palestinians fled or were driven out, were not allowed to come back. At least 2,000 Palestinians have been expelled since that time, before the 400. Palestinians, to a person, see this as the beginning of transfer, as the beginning of their never being able to have a homeland for themselves there. So I think that the power of the metaphor is very important to address and understand. Secondly, you said that one of the things that the Palestinians could do would be to stop the Intifada. The Intifada didn't just happen. The Intifada itself was a response. It was a response to years and years and years of occupation. Just because in this country we didn't know very much about that doesn't mean that it wasn't true. It was a profound and important response for Palestinians. And the third is the visit of Sadat to Jerusalem. Every Israeli Jew I know says that that day was the greatest day of his or her life. It had an absolutely extraordinary impact on Israelis and Jews around the world. It wasn't until quite recently that I learned that, in fact, Sadat was able to do that because he knew what he was going to get for it. He knew that he was going to get the Sinai back. There had been behind-the-scenes negotiations going on for a considerable period of time with very high-level Israeli officials. He still took an enormous risk. He perhaps paid his life for it, but he knew he was going to get something for it. I would say if Palestinians thought that they were going to get something comparable from the negotiations, they'd be back in a minute.
Okay, these are good questions. I'll just address them briefly. That the Intifada emerged from something, yes, I'm cognizant of it. But now we're offering another alternative, peace negotiations. They weren't there in 1987 when it broke out. But now we have peace negotiations in Washington and other sites around the world. So the situation has changed. Now, as far as the expulsions, yes, I am cognizant and aware, as are all Israelis, to Palestinian considerations, including the emotional aspect of that issue. And therefore, within the package of the confidence-building measures we are talking about, there will be a reiteration, or there was already an Israeli statement that that was an exception, and you will probably find within the package, when the Palestinians come back to the negotiating table, reiteration of the timetable, or perhaps even acceleration to some degree of those who were expelled in December, as well as the return of a good number of Palestinians who were expelled for security violations in years past. So we are aware and conscious of that implication. Finally, regarding Sadat and whether he knew what he would get before he came to Israel, I think it doesn't detract even one iota from the emotional appeal, and you're correct in pointing out, making it the greatest day for many Israelis. But I think that Mr. Assad, for example, of Syria, also has a general idea of what he could gain from peace talks. So I don't think the situation in that sense is so different, even though the talks with Sadat emissaries were secret at the time and only came to light later. This time the process is more open, also because of the media, which is all around. So I think essentially the groundwork is there for a bold gesture which would build confidence amongst Israelis and Arabs alike.
We've got 5 minutes. Let me just say, no more questioners. Please stand up. We'll try very quickly to deal with the 4 people who are standing. Yes.
Yeah, my question deals with Islamic fundamentalism, Arab terrorism, and specifically the impact of Hamas on the current talks. To Mr. Levy, I ask, has the increased role of Hamas had an effect to bring closer together the PLO and Israel in the current negotiations? And to Mr. Baba, I ask that earlier in your remarks you characterized support for Hamas in the territories as increased by the deportations, and you made it sound like that before the deportations Hamas was a very fringe group with little or no support. I beg to differ with that, considering that the Hamas activities greatly increased before the deportations, and the numerous number of stabbings and murders is what caused them. So I wonder if you could talk again about how you characterize the role of Hamas and their popularity.
Yeah, short comments, both. First from you.
Briefly speaking, yes, the influence of Hamas and the increase of terrorism and stabbings of Israelis is of concern for us, especially as far as it affects the readiness of Israelis to trust the other side. As far as the PLO, has it brought Israel closer to the PLO? I would say no, because Israel's policy still is that we're negotiating with the Palestinian delegation and not with the PLO, and if and when elections will be held, we'll be negotiating to the democratically elected Palestinian delegation, and the PLO will presumably be on the sidelines or practically not a major actor. However, there are some nuances there, and Israel by now states openly that she knows that many of the delegates, including some of the chief delegates and advisors to the Palestinian delegation, are consulting in a variety of ways and receiving guidelines from the PLO leadership, and we're not really protesting it. In addition, there's been a change of law in the Israeli Knesset regarding meetings with the PLO, but that does not affect government policy as far as seeing the PLO as a partner for negotiations.
Baba, your comment on Hamas.
I think that I did not necessarily want to convey that Hamas played a minimal role or had a small influence in the occupied territories prior to the deportation. My point was, if the intention of the Rabin government was to clip the wings of Hamas and its supporters, it did just the exact opposite, okay? By generating sympathy among a lot of Palestinians who otherwise might not have paid any attention to Hamas. Now, prior to the deportation issue, I think that it is fairly to say that Hamas' influence was more so in the Gaza Strip than it was in the West Bank. Notwithstanding, I believe that the PLO maintains the largest support amongst Palestinians in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and elsewhere.
Question here.
Yes, my question is to Mr. Baba. I might have misunderstood some points in the discussion, but I'd like to know, going back to the issues of confidence building measure, if yes or no, in his information, according to his information, the Palestinian delegation or the Palestinian leadership in the territories would be willing to call for an end to Palestinian violence in the territories, despite the probable ineffectiveness of this step, but merely as an act of improving the atmosphere in the talks.
It is a good question. The answer to that is quite simple from my perspective. If you want to see an end to the Intifada, then give the Palestinian delegates enough to go back with, to start the process of election, to start the process of interim self-government, and you will see an ending, a self-ending of the Intifada.
It's a very good point, sir, but I'm not sure if you really answered the question. at this point? I mean, now at this point in the talks, do you think they would unilaterally be willing to declare
No
call for-
Palestinian, big or small, in their right mind, would ask other Palestinians to stop fighting an occupation.
Thank you.
Question here.
Yes, addressing the issue long range for a permanent peace going into the 22nd century. Could there, do you feel there's prospects for peace to last permanently without a greater move towards democratization in the Middle East? I mean, there are good reasons why democracies virtually never make war on each other. I mean, a real democracy, free elections, free speech, free press, where governments are more accountable to the people, where the people can change the government. I mean, democracy is on the move throughout the world, to some degree, Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, but we don't see it in the Middle East. I guess specifically, are there any prospects, if you feel the premise is correct, for long-range peace, you need democracy? What are the prospects for more democracy in the Middle East? I guess my question, I'd like everybody's response, but there's no time. Mr. Levy, Professor Baba.
Happy to tackle it first.
Quick.
Well, very quickly, I think we can only live by example. I know that the Palestinians are committed to a democratic Palestinian state, period. If there is any type of government that is going to be an autocratic, authoritarian Palestinian government, it will be out of the window faster than you and I can think about it. So we are committed to a democratic Palestinian state. We cannot intervene in the internal affairs of other Arab countries, but certainly other Arabs can see the fruits of our democracy and hopefully would emulate that.
Prefacing my remark just by restating to my colleague here that it is important to stick to the rules of Madrid, and as Mr. Lewis correctly pointed out, they do not stipulate an independent Palestinian state, whether democratic or undemocratic.
Well, I have not addressed that, but let me talk about that. Madrid talks about an interim self-government and then another period of negotiations to decide the ultimate resolution to the conflict.
But it does
the
not predetermine a Palestinian state.
Well, the ultimate resolution from my perspective is an independent Palestinian state. Otherwise, I would be wasting my time and you are sitting here. We do not want to live as a second-class citizen. We do not want to live under any country's flag. We are as intelligent as can be and human beings and about to enter the 21st century. So how can you deny the Palestinians the right to live free in their own land?
We're not denying them the right to live free. Let me remind you, all the Arab delegations, as well as the Palestinian delegation, came to Madrid and signed the documents stipulating the ground rules. They cannot be changed during the course of the negotiations if you want them to succeed. But you know, Mr. Baba, my problem really...
We're not negotiating here. We're not governed by those rules. I think that he's entitled to indicate what his long-range aspirations are, and you are entitled to remind us what the rules of
But I'm not allowed to say so. I would really hope that we do not define them, as was done earlier, as my perspective. I would think, and that's my answer really to your question, yes, we have a problem in building peace in the Middle East with a lack of democracy amongst many of the actors. But it doesn't deter us, because if we'll wait, as you say, to the 22nd century, it will be too long for Israelis, Palestinians, and Arab alike. But I think we can build peace, which will be enduring if we nurture it, and if one other element is present, and we were remiss, I think all of us, if I may say, by not mentioning it tonight, and that is the importance of the involvement of other parties, especially the United States, which brought about this process when establishing the rules for Madrid, hosting the talks in Washington, and carrying it through. So I think we can, especially if we don't look at it through my perspective, but through our perspective and through a spirit of compromise.
Final question.
Okay, thank you for letting me have a question. My question is for Mr. Levy. You said, quote, Israeli settlements have largely been frozen. Senator Patrick Leahy recently told the Senate that if the construction which is underway actually gets finished and inhabited, the settlements can increase by 50%. And we know that Israel has said it is going to complete and presumably people those additional units. Now, in addition to that, Israel has recently given the go-ahead to the most expensive road building project of recent times, which is really a forced settlers-only road. So given these two developments, I would like you to say, is the Palestinian fear that their land is being taken away from them while these talks go on really a meaningless one? And finally, I'd like to know why Israel refuses to negotiate with the one party which could guarantee, which could underwrite a peace process, namely the PLO. South Africa is doing it with the ANC, who they also once called terrorist.
Yeah. Very quickly speaking, I don't think that roads are built for the exclusive use of any nationality, especially not the new roads and the new infrastructure in which we are investing in the West Bank and Gaza for the explicit easing of the situation of the Palestinians, which was created especially in recent weeks with the limitation of the numbers coming in Israel to work because of the spate of stabbing. In fact, we are increasing this investment, and I think many of our counterparts are endorsing this kind of investment, and we're also looking for European and perhaps other participants in these talks and in this increase. In fact, the multilateral talks, especially the economic cooperation workshop, is precisely focusing on this aspect, on increasing the pie which the Palestinians will have in the area and on improving and offering economic development. As far as freezing the settlements, I think it's well known that when the Rabin government came into action, it unilaterally created a freeze on what we labeled political settlements, while continuing what we call security settlements along the border and in Jerusalem. So I think that fact is well known, and anyone following the scene could realize that this was a major political change in the stance of the current government.
Before adjourning the meeting, I'd like to give each of our panelists 1 short minute for a comment. Mr. Baba, do you have some final minute?
I was not warned about this, but my point here is quite simple. The Palestinians stand ready to make peace with the Israelis, period. For us to be able to do so, the Israelis have to come forth with some compromises. The compromises that you've been demanding from me are the compromises that we need from the Israeli side. I believe that Rabin politically is in need of some sort of a settlement. The Palestinians need and want a settlement. And maybe if we can stop the jockeying and our offstandish attitudes, maybe we can achieve real progress within the coming few months.
Thank you. Mr. Consul General.
Well, I think this panel took place in a good spirit. I was especially privileged to be on a panel with a Palestinian colleague. And as I said in my introduction, I think that tells almost all, because I'll use my extra half minute. We did exchange a few barbs and perhaps added a little spice into the exchanges, but it does not detract from our principal view. That is, that Israel sees the Madrid process as the best formula. It is committed to negotiate peace with the Arab states and with the Palestinians, and we have the hope that in spite of these difficulties, and in spite of the impasse created by the decision of the Palestinian and Arab delegations not to come tomorrow to the talks, that the talks would and should be renewed speedily and continued at an accelerated pace, because we do see hope for reconciliation, and we'd like really to build upon it when the timing is good, and the timing now is good.
Mr. Lewis.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you can see in this conversation the hope and the frustration that I have felt for now 25 years in observing and writing about this situation. I've always felt that there was a potential for understanding between, especially among Arabs, Palestinians and Israelis, who are more alike than is generally realized, have a lot in common. I think I find myself, as always, understanding the feelings and the anxieties of both sides. The Israeli concern for security, absolutely. The Palestinian concern to have some control over their own lives, even in the interim authority that's envisaged. And if somehow, or again, I can utterly sympathize with Mr. Levy when he says it's best to talk. I agree with that. It's always best to talk. But then you have to understand also how hard it is to talk when the delegates who are going to do the talking have in effect been told that they may be selling out a group of people who have been expelled from their country in a way that wounds the deepest psyche of Palestinians. So I see both sides. I can only say that I hope the talks resume soon. I think if there's any rationality in human beings, and we can hope there's a little, they ought to succeed.
Thank you. Let me just, before asking you to join me in thanking our guests, let me just share how difficult it is for me, who's written a book on this subject and spent 30 years on the negotiation process, to have bitten my tongue as often as I have. But will you join me in thanking both your colleagues who asked the questions and our three panelists?
Enjoy the panel.